Hi, welcome back to my C10 build. It's been a while. I apologize those guys that have been trying to follow. It's been a bit, but I'm back on the project again and moving forward. So one of the things that on this truck that I was trying to do was put the biggest possible tire I could find underneath there and keep it all tucked in the factory. I also wanted it to be, I wanted it to look factory. I didn't want to do the add-on 4-link type setup. And so if you watch my last video on the springs, I'm putting the springs parallel with the frame rails, moving everything underneath. And so I can run a pretty big tire. I'm running a 31 1850 under there. And so I had to narrow the bed rail, and I want to just show you a couple of ways or what I did on that. So I took out about, it's actually measures out about 7 3/4 inches is what I removed to put the new one in there. And so I just center lined the rail, in between there, measured in between these two, center lined it on this side, and then moved it over and center lined it on that side. It's 7 3/4 inches, but as you can see, when you're done, it will be flush with the frame rail. The bed's over this direction just a little bit. So this is as much tire as you can fit without hitting anything on the frame. And since the springs are going to be parallel underneath, down under here, there won't be anything here on this side of the frame. So this will just be nice and clean. So this ended up being just a little over 19 inches wide. And then I've got about 2.5 inches inside the fender. And so my opening for the tire is 21.5. And the tire itself measures 18.5. So I've got about 1.5 inches on each side. Probably a little bit more on the frame side, but it clears really nice and it'll tuck up in there really well. I'm not really lowering the truck. I'm getting it as low as I can get it without, doing something, significant with the frame. It is a drag truck, street drag. And so, I don't want to run airbags. This rear end needs to be pretty solid. I'm running a high stall, a 4200 stall on a trans brake, and so can't really afford any kind of movement in the suspension. So what I did on these side rails is I kind of wanted to maintain the factory flange and stuff, and so I came inside on this one, and then I came inside on this one. You can kind of see the welds, and then from the top I left about 1/4 inch and then just cut this piece out. I wanted to save this factory corner, and also didn't want these ends coming in jagged. And so when you cut this, these are going to be, kind of potato chip ripple. And so after you cut that piece out, you can come back in here and cut the tops of these ridges. I cut them in about 5/8 of an inch, and then I just pounded them down and tapped them together, and that gives you this nice taper, that matches everything. And so when this is all painted out, nice curved taper here, it's going to look like it came that way from the factory. And then I came back in after I was done with I had some 16-inch angle bent up to fill the gap, and I just set this in between the two pieces and kind of, marked it off, and then welded this in. And I haven't drilled these holes yet. You can see it didn't really line up well until I had the fender well built. So now I will come in, rebolt it up, and then I'll drill these holes through. And so then I just continuous, this is 16 gauge, so it's pretty easy to weld. I'm not a professional welder. Hope you don't get too critical with my welds. But I was able to, weld it continuously all the way around. You can see the light's a little better on this side. And see how these taper down before they hit the angle. And so these two are the factory ones. And then these are the 3 that I added in. And, by moving this whole thing in, kind of sectioning it, moving it in, I was able to retain these little curves and stuff. So when this is all painted out, it'll look like it came that way from the factory. It really is a nice look. The fenders are about 19 inches, 19 1/4, and I don't think I could get it any wider. Plus it would hit the frame. So that was about the maximum on that. So what I wanted to do, I looked at, doing aluminum tubs and all of that, and it certainly would have been faster. But one, they cost money, and 2, I was really wanting more of a factory look. And so what I did is these fender wells for the square bodies, there isn't a left and a right. They're all the same part number. And so my thinking was that I could just take 2 of them and weld them together. And it almost worked. And so on one side, the side that I started with, I cut just the edge flange off. And so this comes on this side of it. And you can see it. I didn't leave much meat on there. I come in just enough to get out of the curve. And you can draw it with chalk. I like tape. One, I like the contrast of it. And then I have a nice line to cut too. So I just taped it across and cut this flange off of the one side. And that made this side open. And then I bolted the other one. So if you're doing this, after you get your bed modified, you bolt this up to the inside and then bolt this up to the fender from the other side and put the 2 of them together. I didn't want to kind of guess at it, and so I literally bolted the 2 halves together and then took a scribe to get my scribe line. But if you're doing that, what's going to happen is these 2 pieces are going to kind of dive in from each side. And so, I could have put some angle on it and did a bunch of that, but really the measurement that you're after is this bottom one. And so once it's bolted to the fender out here and bolted to the bed, and these don't want to tuck in there very nice. And so as you're putting it together, you're going to see there's a pretty big gap in here. And so as I was tightening this up, I took a block and kind of tapped the fender well from the outside until I got this, the fender well nice and tight in here. Then I bolted up the other one on the fender and set it over there. So when I put the 2 halves together, I had this marked down here where it needed to be, and then on the bench I clamped an angle iron across the top and started putting it together. And there was just enough taper on the one side that it didn't want to line up. And so if you care about body lines, I'm trying to keep this body line straight. If you care about that, then that's what I would set on both sides. And so I set that on both sides and I put a screw in there to hold that mark. And then as I was putting it together, I realized that it was just too big. It had the taper on this side was a little larger than this side. And so I ended up putting in these little pie cuts, and it didn't take much, took 3 of them. And this is just a death wheel width. I pulled these together and that was enough. On the second one, I spaced them out a little bit different and it actually worked better and I had less distortion on it. So about 3 side cuts on each side, front and back. is enough to relieve that pressure and make these lie down together. And if you put an angle across the top, you'll see it's not bad. There's a little bit of a bow in it. I would put it back on the bench and take a big mallet and kind of put a little more roundness back into that. These are aftermarket. I got these from Classic Industries. They were fairly cheap, but they're like 20 gauge. They're pretty thin, and I'm not, again, I'm not a professional welder. And so trying to butt weld these together, I was practicing on some pieces and I just couldn't do it. I'm just not that skilled. And so what I did is I just overlapped it. And I use it's called a Whitney punch. Hang on just a second. It's like a paper punch for metal. And so it's kind of a handy tool. They're not cheap, but if you have access to one, or if you know a sheet metal guy, they use these quite a bit. And so I was able to come in and just punch these holes, and it doesn't mar up the surface. It doesn't, distort it or anything. And so I just did those every 2 or 3 inches, and then I just come back and plug welded them. And so it's a nice secure weld. Yeah, I got a little bit of a flange here, but I haven't even attempted to do any kind of paint prep on here. So I'll come back with a disc, like a 5-inch flat disc, and kind of knock this leading edge off. But I'm confident that that'll fill real nice. Again, these are like 20 gauge, so that edge is not very thick. And you can see it's down on there pretty tight. I could go back and, if I need to, just tack this edge every, little bit if it looks like it's not going to lay down. So anyway, that's where I'm at right now. You can see this other one it's kind of setting in place. I don't have it bolted in yet, but it looks really nice. Obviously you're not going to be able to haul plywood anymore. The gap between these two is going to be 33 inches. So I will set my fuel tank back here in the back, and there's plenty of room for that. But yeah, that's how you can get the maximum amount of tire under there. Again, I didn't want to do the external 4-link kind of system. Didn't have the money to build a new custom one. And so I just had, the springs that I talked about in another earlier video. So all my springs are done and arched correctly, and eye placement is correct. And then kind of probably went over my budget a lot, but after looking at what it was going to take to build a 12 bolt that could take the horsepower and narrow it and all of the things necessary, I just went ahead and had a custom 9-inch built. It's a Strange Engineering center section. It's overkill to the max. 456 Detroit locker, but it gave me everything that I wanted on it. Different shock locations, the proper shock locations, welded perches, disc brakes. I mean, it was a nice upgrade, but it was a lot of money. The other thing that I'm working on is these trucks are notorious for having a huge gap between the bed and the cab. And so I've slid the bed forward, and if you use the factory holes, let me walk around to the other side. So that it was, the gap is going to end up being about 3/8 of an inch, but you can kind of see this is where the bed comes up against it now. And in behind here are the nutserts, you know, for attaching this front panel. If you use the factory bolts, they stick out about 1/4 of an inch past the nutserts. And so what I'm going to do is I'll use the bolts, but before I put the bed on, I'll grind the bolt, you know, the threads that are going all the way through, I'll grind those off, and that'll let me push this right up against the cab. So it'll be about a 3/8 inch gap between the cab and the bed when it's all done. So trying to figure out the placement on that instead of doing it the hard way like I did, which was just push it all up there and then check it out. I wanted to leave the factory holes in it. Again, I'm trying to make this look as factory as possible. And so if you go underneath to the frame rail and you look at where these go in, there's one hole that's slotted, the back one. The front one is just drilled straight down. And so if you move that hole, if you move all 4 of these holes 1 inch forward, that's going to allow you to push this bed right up against the cab. This bed mounts directly to the frame, so there's not much flex in it. The cab originally had rubber mounts, and so there's probably quite a bit of wiggle room in the cab, but because of the way, or what I'm doing with this, I'm going to bolt the cab on direct, and I'll probably weld the roll bar to the frame. And so there, I'm not going to have to worry about the flex in between there, but that'll close that gap up. So next video, I will probably get this bed off of here. I've got the typical repair. Somebody jammed the holes through there. The way to plug these is just use a bolt. Find a bolt that kind of fits down through there, weld it in place, and then grind it off flush. You can see I've already done a whole bunch of them. But it will, you know, clean this bed up, and then all the sheet metal is new. I couldn't find, it's a short bed, I couldn't find a replacement bed for it. So I looked around until I found a solid bed floor, and then I just ordered all new sheet metal for it. So tailgate, front panel, everything. So anyway, there's my new hood for it. 14 pounds versus 85 pounds for the original. So that's a nice way to get a big chunk of weight off the front of the truck. But I will hopefully be doing videos on a more regular basis, and we'll see you on the next one.